Hi everyone, today I'm going to be talking about Lux by Sanderson and Bohls. If you are not as up on Brandon Sanderson's social media as I am, or you're not on Audible, you may not have noticed that this book released. This is a book that's set in his Reckoners universe, so the same universe as Steelheart, Firefight, Calamity. It's his science fiction, I guess like urban fantasy, I don't know, maybe more urban fantasy, post-apocalyptic, young adult superhero series that came out a few years ago. Honestly, was never my favorite thing by Sanderson, but it is pretty well proven by now that anything he releases, I will definitely buy. So this book is available right now as an audiobook exclusively. There will eventually be a print release at some point, but it was published, I think, basically by Audible. That's actually really good for me because I've been getting through a ton more audiobooks recently. I had a big uptick in my commuting and traveling, and so I've just had a lot more time in the car to listen to things. This book was perfect for that. I'll talk more about that when I get into the review. But if you guys don't listen to audiobooks or don't have any desire to listen to audiobooks, then you will probably not be too interested in Lux. Or, I mean, if you are interested in it and you don't want to listen to an audiobook, you can just wait until it comes out in print, which should happen eventually. The premise behind the Reckoners series is that a bunch of humans suddenly get superpowers, except either they are all evil people or the superpowers basically turn them evil. So it's basically a post-apocalyptic world full of a bunch of supervillains. And then the Reckoners are a team of normal people who are trying to fight back against these supervillains and defeat them. I definitely feel like it's the closest to an urban fantasy post-apocalyptic vibe. There's a lot of focus on both on action and I guess there's a lot of elements of heist stories in the books in general, which is a genre I know Brandon Sanderson loves. We see that in Mistborn. I think he is probably excited for any chance to write a heist story, honestly. And I do enjoy a heist story myself. I think the fact that you know to expect twists and just there are sort of familiar beats to the story that I personally really enjoy seeing. The main Reckoners trilogy is already a complete arc. Lux was supposed to be a series of co-authored novellas with Bohls, and then I think as they worked on them, what was supposed to be 3 novellas just turned into 1 novel. In general, Brandon Sanderson has started doing a few more co-authored projects recently. I listened to the original that he wrote with Mary Robinette Kowal, which was also an audio exclusive, and I really enjoyed that. It seems like these projects are basically a chance for him to explore some ideas that he doesn't have time to because he's busy with the Cosmere stuff, and also to have an excuse to work with some writer friends. Overall, I'm pretty happy as a fan with how these projects have been handled because he's been promoting them, but they haven't been pushed the same way that a release of a regular Sanderson book would be promoted, so I don't feel overly sold to or like he's selling out by using his name on things. Really, these projects do feel like they are primarily written by the secondary writer, and I think what he does, I think he comes up with the ideas with them, and then they sort of develop it together, and then I think he probably gives feedback and does a feedback draft or critique, so it really does primarily come out as the voice of the second author. That was true with the original, and it's true with Lux, in my opinion, but it still has some elements that you can tell that he had a hand in it. So Lux is about a totally different team of Reckoners than the ones we saw in the main trilogy. They are set in Texas. There are a few cameos, one from an important character from the main series, but really this is a standalone that just fits within the world of the Reckoners. I think in terms of timeline, it's set in parallel with, I think, the final or the last 2 books of the Reckoners trilogy. This book won't spoil that series and vice versa. You can pretty much read it as a standalone. I think most things are explained. You might appreciate, you'll know a little more about what's going on in terms of the lore and how the world works if you've read the main trilogy, but since the characters in this book don't have all that information either, I think it basically works as a standalone even if you've never read any Reckoners books. I didn't feel like Lux was as satisfying to me as an actual Sanderson book would have been. It didn't have some of the things I really enjoy about his books, but it was still very satisfying, and for what it was, I found it to be really enjoyable. It was basically like reading an action movie. In general, my taste in movies is a lot, well, I have to say it, I think my taste in movies is a lot worse than my taste in books. For books, I often like things that are a bit more on the literary side. And when it comes to movies, I want to go to the theater. I want to turn off my brain for 2.5 hours and watch CGI superheroes blow things up on screen and just not have to think or feel really anything. And okay, maybe there are some exceptions, but that's kind of my taste in movie going. And I feel like Lux really leaned towards that, but it was kind of what I needed. I should probably say something about the plot. The main character, Jax, is around 18 or 19 years old. He is a Texas reckoner. He's part of a small team because most of them have been wiped out. And he and the team are going up against this flying city called Lux that is ruled by an epic called Life Force, who has several other epics working for him. Lux, the city, flies around and destroys different areas, and nobody really knows what's up there, but there are kind of rumors that it's a paradise, and there's just all these weird rumors about it. So he and the Texas Reckoners, they want to take down Life Force and sort of destroy this city because it's killing people, but they also want to find out what's going on. Jax lost his parents and his older brother to epics when he was around age 12, and so he's a character that's strongly motivated by revenge, but also he has a strong desire to protect people. So that's kind of the core of the character. Tonally, this book fit very well into the existing Reckoners books, just in terms of the kinds of themes and topics it covered, the beats of the story, what the characters were like. It wasn't so close to Steelheart that it just felt like a knockoff of the same old thing, but there was definitely a lot that was familiar. I felt like the characters were fine. They were enjoyable and distinctive. I can still remember them a few weeks after finishing the book, but they weren't sort of the level of characters that I would typically expect from a Sanderson book. I think they just were a little too cliche and never quite went beyond their archetypes. They were, different enough that you could like and care about them and engage with them, but they weren't the most memorable. They felt a little bit formulaic, like Jax was just kind of a typical teenage male main character. At least in Steelheart, David, the main character, had this really, it was a stupid, funny thing, but he had this thing where he just sort of made bad metaphors all the time, and it was kind of like the typical Sanderson dad humor, but it was kind of funny even though you cringed at it. And Jax didn't really have anything that really stood out. He's really good at this certain kind of technology that they use, but he isn't a super nerd about it the way David and Steelheart is a super nerd about epics. It's just a skill he has that makes him a little bit interesting and distinct and makes him unique to other characters, but he's not as strong a personality, really. The side characters were also enjoyable. I feel like the narrator actually did a pretty good job. There were a lot of different Texas accents in this one, and I got a kick out of some of the voices that the narrator did. Overall, even though I said the tone fit well with the Reckoner series, it went some places that were a little bit darker than I would typically expect a Sanderson book to go. Well, it still was pretty firmly in what I would sort of consider the Sanderson PG-13 rating, but just somehow some of the ways that things were done or the things that happened or that were explored, they were a little darker and more disturbing in some ways. I wouldn't say that it took it to like a new level of grimdark or anything like that. It was not grimdark, but just there was some stuff that was a little more disturbing. Another thing about this that I liked, but that was a bit different than what I would expect from a typical Brandon Sanderson novel, the pacing was intense. It was all action all the time, except for the occasional training montage. That's also why I said this was like reading an action movie. It was a very fast 13 hours of book. If it had been any longer than it was, I think it would have actually been kind of exhausting. But as it was, it was great for a long drive, I have to say. I haven't read anything else by Stephen Bohls because I think all he's published is middle grade, which isn't a genre I read a lot in particularly. But I feel like he did a good job in this collaboration. The writing didn't particularly stand out to me, but it was totally serviceable for the purposes of the story, and I enjoyed it. Interestingly, I think the original Reckoners trilogy was published as YA, and I haven't seen Lux being particularly marketed as YA. I know this is mostly just a marketing choice, and I think Steelheart is something that could go either way anyway. Like, it is neither typical YA nor particularly not YA. The characters of both the original series and Lux are, the main characters anyway, are older teenagers. I think if you listen to a lot of audiobooks, or if, like me, you tend to listen to audiobooks if you have a long drive or you're doing a bunch of chores or cleaning around the house, I think this is a really fun one because it passes the time really well. I don't think it's going to get added to my list of favorite books by Brandon Sanderson, but I really enjoyed the experience of it, to be honest. I needed something kind of light and action-y at the time. It really got me through a lot of hours of driving. And it even ended with that typical action movie ending where it's sort of things get resolved, but there's that one thing that could lead you straight into the sequel if it sells well enough and they decide to make it into a franchise. So I guess we'll see if they decide to make it into a franchise or not. I would definitely read another one, I think. I would continue this series. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this review. Please like, subscribe, whatever. If you made it this far and you're listening to me talk at the end, I guess you maybe enjoyed the video. So let me know down in the comments what you thought, or if you're interested in checking out Lux, or if you already read it, and I'll see you next time.